May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me. And may these words you hear be captured by your soul and enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. The story I want to share with you today, I first heard more than 30 years ago. Not many sermons in my life have stuck with me for more than 30 years. It was a sermon preached by Herb O'Driscoll. Probably many of you will recognize that name. He was an Anglican priest and the dean at the Anglican Cathedral in Vancouver for many years, and continues to lead workshops and discussions. He's the one who I first heard talk about this, and I'm going to try to tell the story as I remember him telling it those 30 years ago. He asked us to imagine ourselves as Martians on a space journey to Earth. The spaceship lands in the middle of the desert, and you get out, and you see a man in the distance speaking to a group of people. As you draw nearer and hear the man speak, it's Jeremiah who's talking, the prophet, who is telling his listeners that God's truth is written on their hearts. If they listen to others who are trying to tell them how they should live their lives, then, he says, they're going to go astray, just as their ancestors did. But if they listen to their hearts, then they will know the truth, and they will be able to follow the truth as they live. This is the age of the Hebrew prophets, and the whole course of the Jewish religion was being transformed by what they were teaching and what they were saying. Then you get back in the spaceship and you travel a little ways, and this time when you land and get out of the spaceship, you're amongst some beautiful buildings, columns, forums, great places of worship. The land of the desert has been replaced by these magnificent buildings, and there's another man speaking to some young men who are gathered around him. As you go up to listen to this man speak, it's Socrates. And he is telling his students that true knowledge and moral virtues are inscribed in the soul of each individual. His goal is not to teach his students knowledge, but to awaken their souls so that their true knowledge there can be set free. This is the age of the great Greek philosophers who taught that truth must not only be discussed, but it must also be lived. You get back in the spaceship again and you head off on the next stage of the journey, and it takes you a considerable longer time to get to the next place where you land. But finally, you do land, and you get out of the spaceship, and the scenery looks quite different than it was before. No deserts, no great forums, it's more countryside here. And the man who you see look quite different in their physical appearance, and very different in what they're wearing. But as you go closer, you hear that there's one man speaking again to a group of other people who are gathered around him, just as it happened in the other places. You discover that you're in China, and it's Lao Tzu that you're hearing this time. And he is talking about how people ought to act in relationship to each other. He is laying out a system of acting, an ethical system, focused on living harmonious lives and not exploiting the earth. He is emphasizing the interconnectedness of human beings over and against human self-centeredness. And he is telling his listeners that they should not exploit each other for self-gain. This time when you get back into the spaceship, you go hardly any distance at all. And when you land, you find out that the crowd looks the same as the crowd that was there before, and their dress is the same as the crowd who was before, because you haven't left China. But here again, there's a man talking to a group of other people. And as you draw closer and hear what he's saying, you discover this is Confucius, who is teaching his listeners about personal and public morality, correctness in social relationships, justice, and sincerity. When asked to define humanness, Confucius says, love your fellow man. These two men are beginning the development of an ethical system that existed all over the Far East, starting in China but spreading to Korea and to Japan. But there's still more to see. And so you get into your spaceship and you head off once more. This time when you land, the people look different from any you've seen before, and their clothes are also somewhat different. You discover that you've landed in India. But here too, there are crowds gathered around a man, and you go close to hear what he's saying, what he's telling them. And if as a Martian you were aware of human history, you would know that this is India and that the man who's speaking is Buddha. And he's telling his listeners that he's awake and that they need to awaken too. He says that if you are awake, then you will be able to overcome anger and greed and ignorance. He says we need to be completely aware of ourselves, and we need to let go of our self-centeredness, our desires, and our cravings. He is teaching a whole new way of thinking that's spread throughout Southeast Asia. Well, if you'd been that Martian traveler, you might get back into the spaceship and head back to Mars again without even realizing the importance of the things that you had just heard. You would be aware that in your trip around the world, you had heard these men in many different parts of the world giving the same message to the various places where they lived. You would be aware that all of these men lived at about the same time, around the year 500 BCE, about 500 years before Jesus was born. Not that they were all contemporaries, but they were born and lived in approximately the same time, within 200 or 300 years of each other. But you might be surprised to know that these men had never known each other, never known that each other existed. You might be surprised that even though they were expressing the same kind of thoughts and the same kind of sentiments, they'd not learned it from the other people that existed at the same time. That in all those places all around the world, the same thoughts and ideas were appearing at the same time. You might be surprised to know that these thoughts and sentiments had never been spoken in the world before. They'd never been thought of before these people started to express them. This was a whole new kind of way, a whole new way of thinking and acting that had not been in the world up until that time. We've given this time a title, and it perhaps is a title you've never heard of before. But this time in human history, around 500 years before Jesus was born, we've given the title the Axial Age, because it was a time when the whole world shifted on its axis. The whole of human interaction shifted on its axis. It was a time shifting away from being localized and self-centered and worrying about me and my family and those around me, shifting away from that towards shifting to think about all of humanity together and how we interact with each other. The idea that we should treat each other in ways that we want to be treated. It was the time when the Golden Rule was born all over the world, expressed in different language in different places, and then expressed a little differently, but still the same idea, growing in all these places, that you should treat other people as you want them to treat you. A new idea born into the world. Well, how could all of this be? I've heard it said many times that there's nothing new under the sun. What goes around comes around, that things keep on happening, that history repeats itself. We've heard that. We've probably said it ourselves many times. And yet, here in this one short period of history, things did change. And the world became different than it had ever been before. Where all the civilizations on the earth began to shift on their axis, and a whole new way of acting together begins to be dreamed of. How could this be? We wonder, how could that happen? Herbert Driscoll finished his sermon by saying that in this short window of time, God acted to change humanity forever. Maybe that's the explanation that you hear that resonates with you. If you don't believe that God intervenes and changes things, then Karen Armstrong, the great religious writer, says that by this point in time, humanity had evolved in their thinking to the place where this great change became possible, that all of humanity had evolved to the point where this idea began to perk up in people's thinking all over the world. However you choose to see it, there's a fact that this did happen, and it changed the ways in which humans acted with each other, and continues to change the way in which we act with each other. I'm going to continue this idea next week, and I'm going to talk about the axial age in a little bit different terms, because it's bothered me ever since I heard that 30 years ago. It's bothered me about why it happened 500 years before Jesus was born. I mean, we think of Jesus as the one who sort of taught us and who became the leader that helped us to move into the future. And yet here, 500 years before he was born, these ideas are already starting to percolate. So I'm wondering if this is part of God's plan. Why wasn't Jesus around when that happened 500 years earlier? Well, I want to talk about that next week, because I think I've got it figured out, at least for myself. And you can come and see if you agree with it. But I think it's really important for us to realize that the future is filled with possibility. Times do change. And I'm going to preach on this again on a third week, because I think we may be in the middle of a new axial age, and I want to say why I think that's true. So, you've got something to look forward to, or a reason to stay away, whichever you decide. But let's have a few moments with these thoughts on what I said today.